It was supposed to be just another visit to the local animal shelter, but when a man in a red plaid shirt stopped in front of one kennel, everything went silent. Rex, a highly trained police German shepherd, suddenly lowered his head and let out a heartbreaking whimper. Then another and another, until tears streamed down his fur, crying like he had just seen a ghost. Officers rushed over, thinking he was injured, but his eyes weren't filled with pain. They were locked on a man standing quietly at the entrance. A man no one recognized. A man the dog hadn't seen in over a year. The man took one step closer, and Rex began trembling uncontrollably. Staff members exchanged confused looks. Why was a trained police dog reacting like this? Who was this man? A threat? Someone from Rex's past? Someone he feared? Or someone he had been waiting for? For years? And when Rex suddenly collapsed against the cage door, desperate to reach that person, the shelter erupted into chaos. What happened next would shock everyone. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The shelter was unusually quiet that morning, except for the soft hum of the ventilation fans and the distant barking of dogs who still had hope in their voices. But at the far end of the hallway, past the louder kennels and the eager tails, sat one dog who never made a sound, a German shepherd, strong, sharp-featured, built like a trained canine, yet completely still, like a statue carved out of heartbreak. Staff members called him Shadow, not because it was his real name, but because he acted like one, silent, fading, always staying in the background as if trying not to be noticed. Every morning, Emily, one of the shelter workers, stopped by his kennel. She always crouched down and tried to catch his eye. "Good morning, buddy," she would whisper. But Shadow didn't move. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't even blink fast like most stressed dogs. He simply stared at the ground or at the metal bars, as if he were waiting for something that never arrived. His water bowl was always half full, untouched. His food barely eaten. And when the other dogs barked excitedly at visitors, Shadow remained silent, like he was living inside a world only he understood. Emily had worked with dogs for years, but she had never seen a dog like him. A well-trained German shepherd should be alert, responsive, and full of energy. But everything about Shadow felt broken. Some nights, when the shelter was empty and the halls echoed with loneliness, Emily would walk through the kennels and stop in front of him again. That was when she sometimes heard it, a low, soft whine, barely noticeable, like a sound escaping from deep pain he couldn't carry anymore. Rumors traveled quickly among the staff. They whispered when they thought he couldn't hear. "He used to be a police dog," one said. "Something happened to his handler," another replied. "Maybe he failed training," someone else suggested, but none of them really knew the truth. All they knew was that Shadow didn't act like the others. He didn't show aggression. He didn't show excitement. He didn't show fear. He showed nothing, only a quiet sadness that clung to him like a shadow he couldn't escape. Yet every day without fail, he kept his gaze fixed toward the shelter entrance. He never reacted to anyone walking by, but he still watched that door with an intensity that didn't match his broken posture, as if he were waiting for a specific pair of footsteps, a familiar voice, someone he believed would come back, and no one understood why. But very soon, they would. The shelter staff didn't usually gossip, but Shadow's presence had turned into a quiet mystery everyone tried to solve. New volunteers asked about him, old employees avoided talking about him, and every time someone paused in front of his kennel, there was always this same heavy feeling hanging in the air, like Shadow carried a story none of them were ready to hear. One afternoon during feeding rounds, two staff members stood near the supply room whispering softly. They thought he was asleep, but Shadow's ears twitched slightly, catching every word. "I heard he came from a police unit," one of them murmured. "A real canine program. Top tier. They don't send just any dog there." The other shook her head slowly. "Then why is he here? Shelters don't get dogs like him unless something went terribly wrong." They weren't wrong. Something had gone wrong, but nobody knew what. Emily, who had a deeper connection with the dogs than anyone else, tried to piece things together from the limited information the shelter received. Shadow's file was strangely incomplete. Most dogs arrived with medical notes, temperament scores, previous owner history, but Shadow's records had almost nothing, just one printed line. Transferred from emergency unit. Previous handler unavailable. Unavailable, a strange word. Cold. Empty. It didn't explain anything. Emily remembered staring at that line for a long time the day he arrived. A police K-9 with no background, no transfer briefing, no explanation. It was unusual, almost suspicious. She had asked her supervisor about it, but he only shrugged and said, "We just take them. We don't always get the stories." But everyone could feel it. Shadow's silence wasn't normal shelter anxiety. It was grief. Deep, heavy grief. Some staff believed he failed his training after losing his partner. Others whispered he witnessed something traumatic during a mission. A few thought his handler simply abandoned him, but Emily rejected that idea immediately. Shadow's eyes didn't look abandoned. They looked loyal, waiting, like he believed with absolute certainty that someone he loved was still out there. Every now and then, a loud noise, a door slamming, a metal bowl dropping, made the other dogs bark wildly. But Shadow reacted differently. His head would jerk up sharply, his body tremble for a moment, and then nothing. No barking, no growling. Only the haunted look of a memory trying to resurface. Whatever his past was, it wasn't just a story, it was a wound. And in the back of the shelter, behind cold metal bars and unfinished paperwork, that wound stayed open, quietly bleeding into every second of his silent existence. What the staff didn't know was that Shadow's life was about to change. And so were all their assumptions about him. Officer Daniel Hayes wasn't supposed to be at the shelter that morning. His unit had simply asked him to evaluate potential K-9 candidates for an upcoming assignment. He expected the usual, energetic dogs, loud barking, tails thumping against kennel doors. But the moment he stepped inside, something felt different. The noise, the smell, the cold concrete floors. Everything was familiar, except for the heavy silence coming from the very last cage on the right. As Daniel walked past the kennels, most dogs jumped up, eager for attention. But when he reached the final row, he paused. There, sitting perfectly still, was the German Shepherd he had heard staff whisper about. The one they called Shadow. The dog didn't move, didn't bark, didn't even adjust his weight. He just sat with his head slightly lowered and his eyes fixed on the entrance door, as if the world behind him didn't matter at all. Daniel frowned. This wasn't normal behavior for a trained German Shepherd. These dogs were built to react. Footsteps, scents, voices, movement. But Shadow remained locked inside his own silent bubble. Curious, Daniel stepped closer, stopping just a few feet from the kennel. "Hey, boy," he said softly, lowering his voice. "You okay?" Shadow didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge him in any way. Instead, his gaze tightened on the shelter entrance, as though waiting for someone specific, someone important. Daniel had worked with K-9 units for almost a decade, and he recognized signs of trauma, withdrawal, depression. But this was different. This wasn't a dog giving up. This was a dog holding on, so tightly that the world around him simply didn't exist. Emily walked up behind Daniel, noticing his stillness. "He doesn't respond to anyone," she said quietly. "Not staff, not volunteers, not visitors. You're the first officer who's seen him." Daniel's eyes stayed on Shadow. "Did he lose someone?" he asked. Emily hesitated. "We're not sure. His file barely has any details." Daniel knelt down, placing his hand on the cold metal bar. "Shadow," he tried again gently, "look at me." But the dog didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't care. His eyes remained glued to the door like he was waiting for a ghost to walk in. Daniel exhaled slowly. He'd seen loyalty. He'd seen grief. But whatever was inside this dog, it was deeper than anything he had ever witnessed. Something in Shadow's heart was still out there, somewhere beyond that entrance, and Daniel didn't know it yet. But the person Shadow was waiting for was already on his way. Daniel was still studying Shadow's posture when a sudden sound echoed through the shelter, the faint click of boots stepping onto the front lobby tiles. It was a normal sound, something every dog here heard dozens of times a day. But this time, Shadow's reaction was anything but normal. His ears snapped upwards so fast that Daniel actually flinched. The dog's entire body stiffened, as if an electric current had run through him. For the first time since Daniel arrived, Shadow blinked. Once, slowly, like he was waking from a long, painful sleep. Emily noticed it too. "That's new," she whispered, stunned. "He never reacts like that." Shadow didn't just lift his ears. He stood up, not wildly, not aggressively. Just slowly, carefully, as if the sound of those footsteps held the power to break him or rebuild him all over again. His tail stayed low, his body tense, his chest rising and falling faster than before. Daniel moved slightly, trying to see through the hallway window toward the lobby. "Someone just walked in," he murmured, "but why is he reacting like this?" Shadow took one small step forward inside his kennel. His claws tapped lightly on the concrete floor. His eyes, usually dull and lifeless, were suddenly burning with something sharp, recognition or fear. Daniel couldn't tell. The dog pressed closer to the gate, stretching his neck as far as the bars allowed, staring directly toward the main entrance, as if the world depended on what happened next. The footsteps grew louder, moving from the lobby toward the hallway. Shadow's breathing quickened. A tremble ran through his legs. His ears locked forward like finely tuned antennas, picking up a familiar frequency. Daniel felt the air shift around them, a heavy, emotional tension that didn't make sense yet. Emily stepped back. "Daniel? I've never seen him like this. Who could he possibly be reacting to?" Shadow's tail wasn't wagging, it was shaking, not from excitement, but from a deep, overwhelming emotion he couldn't contain. Then Daniel heard it, a man's voice speaking softly at the reception desk. Calm, steady, with a hint of exhaustion. Shadow's entire body leaned toward the sound. His eyes widened, and for the first time since arriving at the shelter, the dog let out a low, shaky whine. A sound so fragile, so broken, that it felt like the walls themselves tightened around it. Something was happening, something big, and Daniel suddenly realized, whoever those footsteps belonged to, Shadow knew them. The shelter hallway, normally filled with restless barking and echoing noise, suddenly felt unnaturally still. Emily exchanged a worried glance with Daniel, unable to hide the shock on her face. Shadow, the silent, unresponsive, emotionally shut-down dog, was acting like an entirely different animal. His chest rose and fell in quick bursts, his paws shifting nervously, his eyes locked on the hallway with desperate intensity. "What's gotten into him?" Emily whispered, almost afraid to speak louder. "He's never reacted to anyone like this." Daniel stepped closer to the kennel, studying the dog's body language. "This isn't fear," he murmured. "This is recognition." Something clicked inside him. But how could he recognize someone? Shadow had barely acknowledged any human since arriving. He didn't respond to voices, footsteps, or scents. Yet now every muscle in his body was reacting as though the impossible had just walked through the door. Another staff member, Jacob, approached from behind, carrying a clipboard. "What's going on? I heard a noise." Emily pointed at the trembling German shepherd. "Look at him. He's different." Jacob frowned, watching the dog's intense focus. "That's not normal," he muttered. "Is he about to get aggressive?" But Daniel shook his head. "No, this isn't aggression." He crouched to Shadow's eye level, speaking softly. "Who are you waiting for, boy?" Shadow's response was immediate. Another low whine, filled with a mixture of longing and fear. His tail stayed low, his body trembling like he was fighting memories that hurt too much to surface. Jacob took a step back. "I've never heard him make a sound," he whispered. "This is new." Emily felt a pressure rise in her chest. What if this is someone from his past?" she asked. "Someone important?" Daniel nodded slowly. "It's possible. Dogs don't forget people. If he had a handler—" His voice trailed off as he watched the dog cling to the bars with silent desperation. The staff gathered around the kennel, confusion turning into concern. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. They simply watched a dog they thought was broken reveal a crack in his silence. A crack filled with emotion they didn't know he was capable of showing. Shadow suddenly took another shaky step forward, pressing his forehead against the cold metal gate. His eyes were glassy, his breathing uneven. It wasn't just a reaction, it was a plea. Something inside him had awakened, and the person who triggered it was getting closer every second. The tension in the hallway thickened as the sound of steady footsteps moved closer. Every tap of the man's boots against the concrete echoed like a countdown. Shadow's breathing turned rapid, almost frantic, his eyes locked so fiercely on the approaching silhouette that Daniel felt the hairs on his arms rise. This wasn't a normal reaction. This was something raw, something personal. Emily stepped back as the figure finally entered the hallway. A tall man in a worn jacket, his shoulders slouched from exhaustion, his face partly hidden beneath a trim beard. He walked with a slight limp, as if every step carried a memory he didn't want to revisit. His eyes scanned the kennels with quiet uncertainty, until they landed on Shadow. The man froze. For a long moment, he didn't blink, didn't move, didn't breathe. His hands slowly tightened around the strap of the bag on his shoulder, knuckles turning pale. Daniel noticed the shift immediately. "Sir," he asked gently, "are you looking for a specific dog?" But the man didn't answer. His eyes were locked onto Shadow the same way Shadow's were locked onto him, like two souls recognizing each other after being lost in different worlds. Shadow's legs trembled violently as he pressed his entire weight against the gate. His tail stayed low, shaking uncontrollably. His ears flattened. A soft, broken whimper escaped his throat. Not the sharp sound of excitement, but a painful cry buried deep inside him for far too long. Emily's heart squeezed painfully. "Oh my God," she whispered. "He knows him." The man slowly stepped forward, each movement hesitant, like he was afraid the moment would vanish if he moved too fast. His eyes glistened, the roughness on his face cracking as emotions he clearly tried to bury began rising to the surface. He can't be," the man muttered under his breath, voice trembling. Daniel watched with disbelief. "Sir, do you know this dog?" The man swallowed hard. I used to," his voice cracked, "but I thought he died." Shadow let out another trembling whine, pressing his face harder against the metal, as if begging the man to come closer. Tears welled in the dog's eyes. Real tears, something none of the staff had ever seen before. Emily covered her mouth, struggling to breathe. Jacob whispered, "Dogs don't react like this unless the bond was unbreakable, unless the separation was traumatic, unless the man standing there wasn't just anyone. He was someone Shadow had been waiting for. Every single day, every single minute, and now he was finally here." The hallway went silent, so silent that even the dogs in nearby kennels stopped barking, sensing something extraordinary unfolding. Shadow stood completely still, trembling, his breath sharp and uneven. His eyes, usually empty, distant, lifeless, now glimmered with a heartbreaking mixture of hope and fear. Then, to everyone's disbelief, a single tear rolled down his fur-covered cheek. Emily gasped, "He's crying!" Her voice cracked as she stepped back, unable to comprehend what she was witnessing. Dogs whined, barked, growled, but they didn't cry like humans. Yet Shadow was doing exactly that, the emotion in his eyes deep enough to melt every person in the hallway. The man took a slow step forward. Shadow didn't retreat. Instead, he lifted his head slightly, ears flat against his skull, tail still trembling low to the ground. His legs wobbled as if they couldn't hold the weight of the moment. Another tear welled up, then another. It was the raw expression of a heart remembering something it thought was lost forever. Daniel whispered, "I've never seen a canine react like this." No one answered him. They couldn't. The man finally reached the front of the kennel. He hesitated, his hand hovering inches from the metal bars. "Shadow?" he whispered, voice breaking. The name fell into the air like a key, unlocking something buried deep within the dog's soul. Shadow's reaction was immediate. His entire body collapsed downward, not in fear, but in an emotional surrender. He lowered himself until his chest touched the cold floor, his nose pressed against the gap between the bars, reaching for the man's hand that wasn't even touching him yet. A sound rose from his throat, half sob, half whine, so painful it sent chills down every spine in the room. Emily covered her mouth as tears blurred her own vision. Jacob turned away, struggling to hold back emotion. Even Daniel, someone who had witnessed countless K9 reunions and heartbreaking goodbyes, felt his throat tighten. There was something indescribable about the way Shadow clung to the man's presence, like a child finding a parent after believing they were gone forever. The man finally placed his shaking hand against the bars. Shadow pressed his face against it instantly, eyes squeezed shut, tears wetting the metal. The man's shoulders shook as he whispered, "I thought I lost you. I thought you died that night." Shadow whimpered louder, desperate, broken, relieved all at once. This wasn't a reunion. This was a miracle, a moment stitched together by pain, loyalty, and a bond stronger than time itself. And for the first time since arriving at the shelter, Shadow didn't look lost anymore. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound in the hallway was Shadow's soft, trembling whines as he pressed against the bars, refusing to look away from the man in front of him. Finally, Daniel stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "Sir, who are you to this dog?" The man swallowed hard, as though trying to steady himself before opening a door he had spent months trying to close. His fingers tightened around the cold metal, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "My name is Officer Ryan Brooks," he said quietly. "Shadow. He used to be my partner." Emily's breath caught. Jacob froze mid-step. Daniel blinked in disbelief. A K9 and his handler were bonded through trust, training, and life-or-death moments. Losing that bond wasn't like losing a pet. It was like losing a part of yourself. Ryan kept his eyes on Shadow, his expression breaking piece by piece. "We worked together for 3 years. He wasn't just a police dog. He was my best friend. My family." Shadow pressed harder against the bars, whimpering at the sound of Ryan's voice. He recognized every syllable, every breath, every emotion buried in it. Daniel stepped closer. "But why did his file say your status was unavailable?" Ryan exhaled shakily, tears gathering in the corners of his eyes. "Because everyone thought I was dead." Silence slammed into the hallway like a wall. Ryan's gaze dropped to the floor as he continued, voice trembling. "Last year during a raid, there was an explosion. I was hit first. Shadow tried to pull me away, but the fire was spreading too fast. My team dragged him back before he could get hurt. I blacked out in the chaos." He paused, blinking hard. "They couldn't find my body for hours. The unit assumed I didn't make it, and Shadow was separated from the team for medical care." Emily covered her mouth. "So he lost you that night?" Ryan nodded. "And I lost him." His voice cracked completely now. "When I woke up in the hospital, I was told he had been transferred to another facility. But when I recovered enough to search for him, he was gone. No records, no trail. I thought he'd been adopted or," he swallowed hard, "or euthanized." Shadow whined louder, desperate, emotional, as if begging Ryan not to finish that thought. Ryan knelt down, placing both hands against the bars. "I never stopped looking for you," he whispered. And Shadow, trembling uncontrollably, let out a broken, relieved cry, a sound of a soul finally finding what it lost. The hallway around them slowly faded into silence as Ryan took a shaky breath, his eyes fixed on Shadow as if he were reliving every second of the night that tore them apart. "It happened so fast," he murmured, voice low, heavy. "One moment we were moving in position, the next, everything exploded." Daniel leaned in, listening closely. Emily stepped beside him, her eyes glued to Ryan's expression. Whatever happened that night wasn't just tragic. It had carved scars into both man and dog. Ryan continued, his hands tightening against the bars. "We were responding to a warehouse call, suspected trafficking ring. Shadow was ahead of me, nose to the ground, searching, focused like always." His lips pressed together. Then something felt off. He stopped. He froze, the same way you saw him do earlier. Emily's breath caught. He sensed danger? Ryan nodded. He always did. Shadow tugged on his leash, pulling me back. A split second later, the entire left side of the warehouse blew apart. His voice shook. I was thrown through the air. I hit a steel beam. Shadow tried to drag me away, but the second explosion went off even closer. Shadow whimpered, the memories clearly burning inside him too. Ryan swallowed, struggling to continue. I remember hearing him bark, not aggressive, but desperate. He was clawing at the ground, trying to reach me. Then someone from the team grabbed him. They forced him back. He fought them, but they wouldn't let him stay. Flames were everywhere, smoke so thick I couldn't see. Daniel's chest tightened as he imagined the scene. A loyal K9 trying to save his handler, a handler watching his partner being dragged away into chaos. I lost consciousness, Ryan said softly. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. I kept asking where Shadow was. No one could give me an answer. He exhaled hard. I was listed as missing, then presumed dead. Shadow was transferred during the confusion, and the paperwork got lost in the mess. Emily wiped a tear. So he thought he failed to save you? Ryan shook his head quickly. No, he didn't fail. He saved me. He tried harder than any human could. His voice cracked again. But he didn't know I survived. He must have waited, confused, heartbroken, thinking I abandoned him. Shadow pressed his face harder against the bars, crying softly as if begging Ryan to understand the pain of waiting for a year with no answers. Ryan whispered, voice trembling. I'm sorry, boy. I never stopped fighting my way back to you. And in that moment, everyone understood. This wasn't just a tragic story. It was a bond torn apart by fate, now fighting its way back together. Ryan stayed kneeling in front of the kennel, his fingers gripping the cold metal as if afraid it might disappear. Shadow pressed his face against the bars, his body trembling uncontrollably. For a long moment, neither of them moved. It was as if time itself hesitated, giving them a second to breathe after losing an entire year to heartbreak. Finally, Ryan whispered, Shadow, it's really me. The words were soft, but they carried a weight that settled deep into the dog's soul. Shadow's ears twitched. His breathing slowed slightly. Then, with painful hesitation, he lifted his paw and pushed it through the bars, touching Ryan's hand. A broken whine escaped him, soft, desperate, filled with all the confusion and longing he had carried alone for too long. Emily felt her heart twist. He's trying to touch him, she whispered. Daniel swallowed hard. No, he's trying to make sure he's real. Ryan's hand trembled as he gently cupped Shadow's paw. I'm here now, he said, voice cracking. I'm not going anywhere. I promise. Shadow took a step back, not to retreat, but to gather the courage to do something he hadn't done since the night of the explosion. He stood tall, weak, shaking, but determined. Then he leaned his head against the bars, pushing his muzzle through the small gap, trying to bridge the distance between them. Ryan dropped his forehead against the bars too, closing his eyes as tears slipped down his cheeks. I missed you every single day, he whispered. Shadow's breath hitched, his nose nudging Ryan's skin with gentle urgency. He whined again, a sound so raw and emotional that it forced Emily to wipe her eyes. Slowly, carefully, Daniel unlocked the kennel door. The click echoed through the hallway. Shadow froze instantly, staring at the opening like it was something unreal. Ryan opened the door fully, stepping back just a little so Shadow could choose on his own. Come here, boy, Ryan murmured. Shadow took one shaky step outside the cage, then another. Then his legs buckled for a moment before he pushed himself forward, inch by inch, until his head reached Ryan's chest. Ryan wrapped his arms around him, pulling him close for the first time in a year. Shadow pressed his entire body against him, burying his face in Ryan's jacket, whimpering as if releasing every bit of pain he had held in silence. The shelter staff watched, speechless. This wasn't just a dog approaching his handler. This was a soul finding home again. A reunion born from fire, loss, and love that never died. For a moment, No one in the hallway dared to breathe. Shadow pressed himself against Ryan with so much emotion that his body shook, and as Ryan held the dog he thought he had lost forever, something inside him finally broke. Quietly, painfully, beautifully. Ryan's shoulders trembled first, then his breath hitched, and suddenly he was no longer Officer Ryan Brooks, the strong, trained handler everyone knew. He was just a man reunited with the one soul who had never failed him. Tears slipped down his cheeks as he buried his face into Shadow's fur, his voice trembling with memories he had tried to bury. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I didn't come sooner." Shadow pulled back just enough to look at him, ears low, eyes filled with the same heartbreak. Then he nudged Ryan's chin with his muzzle, a gesture so gentle it felt like forgiveness poured into a single touch. Ryan let out a shaky laugh through his tears, overwhelmed by the loyalty that never faded. Not even after the world convinced them both they were alone. Emily's own eyes blurred with tears. She had seen countless reunions, but this was different. This wasn't a dog greeting a familiar face. This was two souls stitching themselves back together after being ripped apart. Jacob wiped his eyes quietly, pretending he had something in them. Daniel stood frozen, unable to hide the tightness in his chest. Even the dogs in nearby kennels seemed to sense the sacredness of the moment. They stayed silent, watching. Ryan placed both hands gently on either side of Shadow's face, lifting it until they were eye level. "You saved me that night," he whispered. "You tried harder than anyone. And when I woke up, I thought you were gone. But I kept looking for you." His voice cracked again. "I just never thought the world would give me a second chance." Shadow's tail moved, slow, careful, like he was afraid of breaking the fragile moment. Then he leaned forward again, pressing his forehead into Ryan's chest. A deep, relieved breath escaped him, as if he was letting go of a year's worth of pain. Ryan cradled the dog's head against him. "You're still my partner," he murmured. "You always will be." The shelter staff exchanged emotional glances. They weren't just witnessing a reunion, they were witnessing a healing, a silent promise rekindled. Two lives broken by tragedy, now finding strength in each other again, and neither of them wanted to let go. While Ryan held Shadow close, Daniel quietly stepped aside, pulling out the dog's thin case file. It was barely 2 pages, and even those pages were filled with missing lines, blank boxes, and vague notes. Something about it felt wrong. A police K-9 didn't just appear in a shelter with no transfer details. There was always a chain of command, a process, a paper trail. But here, nothing. Emily stood beside him, wiping her eyes as she whispered, "There has to be more. No way a trained K-9 like him got here without a full report." Daniel nodded. "I agree. Something doesn't add up." He flipped the file again, studying every incomplete line. One phrase stood out. "Unfit for reassignment due to emotional impairment. Handler, unavailable." Daniel frowned. Emotional impairment? For a dog this loyal, this intelligent? Something was off. He approached Ryan gently. "Sir, I need to ask, did anyone inform you that your dog was marked psychologically unstable?" Ryan's eyebrows pulled together in confusion. "What? Shadow? Unstable?" He shook his head firmly. "Never. He was one of the best in the unit. Brave, sharp, steady under pressure. If anything, he was the one keeping me steady." Emily stepped forward. "Then why would they label him unfit?" Ryan took the file from Daniel and read the line himself. His jaw tightened. "This isn't right. After the explosion, he must have panicked. He thought he lost me." His voice softened. "He wasn't unstable. He was grieving." Daniel nodded. "And instead of giving him time, they pushed him out of the system." The realization hit him hard. He didn't fail the program. The system failed him. Shadow nudged Ryan's hand, sensing the shift in emotion. Ryan gently rubbed behind his ears. "You didn't do anything wrong," he whispered. "You were trying to find me. You were hurting." Emily stepped closer, her voice trembling. "He must have waited for you at every transfer, expecting you to walk in." Ryan exhaled shakily. "And when no one came, they probably assumed he couldn't work anymore." They didn't understand what he lost. Daniel's voice grew firm with conviction. This dog didn't break. He held on. All this time, waiting. He closed the folders softly. This wasn't a failed canine. This was a loyal partner left in the dark. Emily looked down at Shadow with new understanding. He wasn't silent because he was dangerous, she said. He was silent because his world ended, and he didn't know why. Ryan pulled Shadow even closer. Well, he knows now, he whispered, and for the first time, Shadow lifted his head with a look that carried something stronger than pain. Hope. Shadow had finally found the one person his heart had been aching for. And now that Ryan was in front of him again, something changed inside the dog. Something deep, instinctive, impossible to ignore. As Ryan shifted slightly, trying to stand up, Shadow panicked. His paws scrambled forward, claws scraping against the floor as he pressed his body harder against Ryan's legs, refusing to let even an inch of distance form between them. Emily gasped softly. He's afraid you'll disappear again. Ryan froze, looking down at Shadow with a heartbreakingly tender expression. Hey, it's okay. I'm not going anywhere. He reached out, gently holding Shadow's face. But the moment Ryan tried to straighten up, Shadow whined loudly, a painful, broken sound that echoed through the hallway. Daniel stepped closer. He's terrified, he murmured. He thinks if you move away, he'll lose you again. Shadow pushed his head under Ryan's arm, nudging him with desperate urgency. His tail wasn't wagging. It was tucked, trembling. His whole body leaned into Ryan as if trying to anchor him in place. Every muscle, every breath, every sound from Shadow screamed the same thing. Don't leave me again. Ryan knelt back down immediately. Shadow exhaled in relief, placing his paw firmly on Ryan's thigh, as if physically holding him there. Ryan felt the weight of that paw, the weight of a year's worth of confusion, fear, and waiting. I'm sorry, Ryan whispered, voice cracking again. You held on to me even when you thought I was gone, and I didn't even know where you were. He gently stroked Shadow's fur. I won't ever walk away from you again. Shadow pressed his forehead against Ryan's chest, breathing in his scent with long, heavy exhales, memorizing it, grounding himself with it. His grip tightened, claws curling slightly around Ryan's arm whenever he felt even the slightest shift. Emily wiped her eyes. Look at him. He literally can't let go. Jacob whispered, I think he's scared this is a dream. Ryan pulled Shadow closer. You're not dreaming, buddy, he murmured. I'm real. I'm here, and I'm yours. Shadow's whine softened into small, relieved breaths, but he still refused to loosen his hold. His body remained glued to Ryan's side, as if the universe would rip them apart again if he let even a second pass without contact. This wasn't just attachment. This was survival. Shadow had lived a year with a hole in his world, and now that the missing piece was back, he wasn't risking anything. And in that moment, one truth became painfully clear. Shadow wasn't just reunited. He was finally whole again. The staff knew that something extraordinary was happening, but protocol still had to be followed. After several minutes of allowing Shadow and Ryan to stay locked in their emotional reunion, Daniel gently cleared his throat. Ryan, before we release him fully, the vet needs to run a final check, just to make sure he's okay after everything he's been through. Ryan nodded, though he kept one hand on Shadow's back, as if afraid even a moment without contact would break the fragile peace between them. Shadow refused to step away, pressing against him protectively. Emily knelt nearby and whispered softly, It's okay, boy. You're safe. He's not leaving. Slowly, Shadow allowed the vet team to approach. Even then, he never took his eyes off Ryan. Every time the stethoscope touched his chest or someone lifted his paw, he looked back at Ryan for reassurance. And each time, Ryan gave him a gentle nod, a soft whisper, or a calming touch. The vet, Dr. Hill, worked with quiet focus. After a full examination, she stepped back, impressed. He's healthier than we expected, she said. Emotionally scarred, yes, but physically strong. His heart rate stabilizes every time he looks at you. Ryan gave a soft smile. He always did trust me more than anyone. Dr. Hill flipped through her report. There's no reason to delay. If you want to take him home, Officer Brooks, we can finalize the adoption today. Shadow instantly perked up at the tone of her voice, even if he didn't understand the words. His tail moved, slow, cautious, like a spark trying to remember how to burn again. Ryan's eyes softened. I want him with me. I've wanted that since the day I woke up in the hospital. Emily brought over the adoption forms. Normally this process takes time, she said gently, but in cases like this, it's more than paperwork. It's about giving both of you a chance to heal. Ryan filled out the first page with trembling hands. Shadow stood beside him, leaning against his knee, refusing to move even an inch away. Each signature felt like a step toward rebuilding their life together. When the last paper was signed, Emily handed Ryan the collar Shadow had arrived with, a simple worn tag still attached. Ryan held it carefully, brushing his thumb over the faded letters. K9 Shadow, Unit 7. He knelt down, securing the collar gently around Shadow's neck. This time, he whispered, you're going home with me. Shadow leaned into him, eyes soft, body relaxed for the first time in a year. The adoption wasn't just approved. It was a promise, one neither of them would ever break again. The moment the paperwork was completed, something shifted in the atmosphere. The tension that had weighed heavily on everyone's shoulders finally lifted. Ryan stood up slowly, and Shadow rose with him, so close that their movements synced like two halves of one story finally reunited. The shelter door opened quietly as Emily stepped aside, giving them space to walk out together. Shadow hesitated for a second, staring at the sunlight pouring through the doorway. It was the first time in months he faced the world not as a broken, abandoned K9, but as someone who belonged again. Ryan gently placed his hand on Shadow's back. Come on, buddy. Let's go home. Shadow took a single step forward, and then another. Each step seemed lighter, more confident, as if he was shedding pieces of his old heartbreak with every movement. Outside, the air was crisp and full of life. Birds chirped, cars passed, and Shadow lifted his head, taking it all in as if rediscovering the world he once feared he'd never see again. Daniel, Emily, and the rest of the staff followed them outside, unable to resist witnessing the final moment of a story that had touched every corner of the shelter. Emily whispered, "Look at him. He's a completely different dog." She was right. Shadow's tail, once tucked tightly under his legs, now swayed gently. His ears were relaxed, his steps sure and steady. But most importantly, his eyes were alive again, filled with trust, filled with purpose. Ryan knelt beside him, placing both hands on either side of Shadow's face, as if trying to memorize every detail all over again. "I can't promise life will be easy," he whispered, "but I can promise you'll never face anything alone again." Shadow pressed his forehead to Ryan's, closing his eyes in complete, peaceful surrender. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't relief. It was deeper, an expression of a bond that had survived explosions, separation, fear, and time. A bond that refused to die. Ryan opened the car door, and Shadow hopped inside immediately. No hesitation, no fear. He curled up on the seat, resting his head where Ryan's hand could reach him easily. When Ryan sat beside him, Shadow nuzzled his arm, content, safe, whole. Daniel exhaled. "That's not just a reunion," he said softly. "That's fate giving them a second chance." As the car rolled forward, Shadow looked out the window once, ears perked, eyes shining, and then turned back to Ryan, laying his head gently in his lap. Hope restored, home reclaimed, a loyal heart finally at peace. Their story wasn't ending. It was just beginning.